Talking about the metallic poisons, ethylene glycol poisoning cannot be ignored over here. We've already discussed the corrosive actions and the phenols and the action of the alkalis on the human body, and now we are dealing with the ethylene glycol. So, what are the sources behind these ethylene glycol poisoning? What is the symptomatology that is being observed over here when we are dealing with the subject of toxicology? There can be a medical emergency where you deal with these ethylene glycol poisoning. So, what are the sources? How are we going to deal with such emergencies? And if death ensues in cases of fatal conditions that has occurred or complications has occurred in cases of these glycol poisonings, how are we going to find on the autopsy that what are the particular features of the autopsy that is going to basically mark towards this poisoning or diagnose these cases of ethylene glycol poisoning. Sampling is another thing. So basically the routine samples that are sent to the chemical pathologist that are always there, that includes basically the brain, the liver, and the kidneys, but still we are going to take the blood, the urine, the blood samples as well as the urine samples and add preservatives. For example, sodium fluoride is added along with these samples and that are sent to the chemical pathologist for further assays. So in this section, the highlight is basically the autopsy findings. What are the autopsy findings that are being observed in these cases of ethylene glycol poisoning? And then we'll move on to the laboratory analysis. As I've already told you, the tissue samples are taken and they're routinely taken and sent to the chemical pathologist. And secondly, we'll focus on the blood and the urine samples as well. Then we'll move on to the oxalic acid and the oxalate salts. So it's one of the basically highlight over here that this oxalic acid, it has a lot of corrosive action on the human body. And these oxalate salts have particular characteristics which are quite similar to the corrosive acid poisoning. So we'll be discussing that over here. So the autopsy findings are quite similar to that of the corrosive poisoning. So that is basically discussed over here in this section. Now the ethylene glycol poisoning, the features which are common with the oxalate poisoning are basically, they're also observed in these cases of the ethylene glycol poisoning. So it will be quite a confusing state to basically differentiate between the ethylene glycol and the oxalate poisoning. Antifreeze agents are used for preserving the samples as well as preserving the tissue samples as well as the blood and the urine samples. The source of intoxication is also being investigated in these cases of the ethylene glycol poisoning. So the medico-legal importance still lies over here, and it can be of a homicidal and rarely it can be of suicidal, as well as it can be of a self-administered kind of a poisoning or the accidental kind of poisoning. So it is basically a drug of abuse, and we have to identify the complications as well. The complications, of course, it can be a comatose patient, asphyxiating conditions can arise in such conditions, and finally, if the condition is quite fatal to ensue death, death may occur. So first effects resembles the drunkenness. The drunkenness, or it can be a state of altered consciousness. So that is basically that was also observed in cases of the cyanide poisoning. So alcohol intoxication, cyanide poisoning, and the ethylene glycol poisoning, they are of a similar characteristic. Then the autopsy findings. Now at autopsy, no local damage is being observed in cases of the autopsy. So that is basically the highlight over here, that we won't observe any marks externally, or no external features are being observed in cases of this glycol poisoning. Talking about the calcium oxalate monohydrate crystals in the kidney. So the main organ of metabolism is basically the kidney and the liver, mainly the kidney, and so these crystals are going to be observed in the kidneys. The renal tubular necrosis failure, because the kidneys are the main metabolic organs, and so the tubular necrosis is being observed in these cases of glycol poisoning. Cerebral edema is again the mainstay over here, and it is one of the complications that is being observed in these cases of glycol poisoning. The chemical meningoencephalitis. So it is a kind of infectious condition that mimics the chemical reactions. So it is going to be a chemical reaction as well as it is going to mimic an infection and encephalitis reaction. So that is going to be observed over here as well. Now there will be a diffuse liver damage alongside all of these cases of the renal tubular necrosis, the cerebral edema, and the liver damage is also going to be observed in these cases. Now we'll have primary hyperoxalurias, and that will basically include the phenols 1, 2, and 3. So these are basically observed in the urine. So as I was already talking about, the urine samples are sent to the chemical pathologist, and that will basically confirm these primary oxalurias, hyperoxalurias that are usually present in the urine. But in these states of toxicological analysis, they are going to be of a raised level. There will be a hyperaxaluria. Episodes of nausea and vomiting. So as the consciousness is quite deranged, and there will be nausea and vomiting also observed and characterized. Dehydration is one of the symptoms that is observed in cases of ethylene glycol poisoning. Now lactic acidosis. So it's another feature of the glycol poisoning, and all of these will be confirmed through the blood samples as well as through the urine samples and the tissue samples. So the renal tubular necrosis is going to be confirmed after we take sections of the kidneys and they are sent to the chemical pathologist, and once he or she confirms the presence of the tubular necrosis as well as the presence of this oxaluurias in the urine samples as well as the lactic acidosis in the blood samples. So that will basically complete the picture and give us the picture of the glycol poisoning in these cases. The laboratory analysis is the mainstay over here. This is a diagram basically showing ethylene glycol being converted to glycoaldehyde, glycolic acid, oxalic acid, and finally the oxalic acid. And oxalic acid is the final outcome to this glycol poisoning. The blood levels depend upon the time elapsed since ingestion. So it will be more than 300 milligrams per liter amount, and the average is 2400 milligrams per liter in the samples before the second day of the ingestion. Now the brain is almost 300 to 4000 milligrams per kilogram concentration is being observed in the brain samples, and the urine samples basically indicate the presence of this oxalic acid in the amounts almost 600 to 1000 milligrams per liter. Now, the oxalic acid has this coffee ground appearance and is locally corrosive, it is poisonous, causes death within minutes or hours. So that is basically a quick fatal period, and shock and hypocalcemia are the main complications being observed in this oxalic acid poisoning. The fatal systemic effects are basically the cause of the death that ensues finally. The autopsy findings in cases of oxalic acid poisoning is basically the bleaching effect, and it has that corrosive action that is being observed in those cases of particular or peculiar corrosive acid poisoning, and the mucosa of mouth, pharynx, and esophagus turns white. There are local hemorrhages, and the stomach turns dark brown or black from the acid hemetin. There are acute erosions and abnormalities of the muscle functions are being observed over here, as well as precipitation of body calcium. Now, the renal failure is one of the complications that is observed over here because the main metabolism occurs in the kidneys, and the necrosis in the proximal convoluted tubules is also one of the feature for this oxalic acid poisoning. So in this section, basically, we dealt with the ethylene glycol poisoning, and as an end product, we get the oxalic acid and how is it harmful to the human body. That is the end of this section. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.